Hiya, CP government. You might remember yesterday when I told you I wouldn't be here on Friday. Well, I wasn't kidding. I'm really not here. But that doesn't mean you can't have the fun of government notes, all the fun and excitement that entails. So, if you'll go ahead and take out your notebooks, we're going to try and get through the rest of the unit today, and then we'll do a Kahoot on Monday and take a test on Tuesday. So, don't worry though if you don't finish everything today. Like I said, anything we don't take care of today, we will take care of on Monday, hopefully including the Kahoot. I'll also have your tests back for you by that point, and yeah, I think that's everything I owe you. So go and take out your notebooks while I amuse myself. And give you 30 seconds. No pausing, that would be cheating. 20 seconds. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Notes time! Okay, where we left off. We're talking about specific powers of the president, talking about executive powers, his legislative powers, and his judicial powers. The executive powers are going to be the biggest and most extensive, at least, because remember, it's the executive branch. That's what he does. Now, in terms of some of the specific things he can do that fall into the executive powers, he's got his cabinet, would be the first thing. So, cabinet, I would write that down. So, cabinet. The cabinet refers to the group of helpers that work with the president. These are his official advisors. Each one is the head of a department. Again, there's a group of advisors. Each one is the head of a department. And so each one has basically their own little specialty. And for example, now there are 15 of them, and they range from the Department of Energy to the Department of Defense to the Department of the Treasury to the Department of Justice, etc. So it's like each of them have their own little area. And the president is the head of all of them. So the logic is that they have their own little area to focus on, but the president is, of course, the ruler of them all, or the leader of them all. So they provide advice, but it's up to him to figure out what exactly to do about it. Now, the cabinet is not actually in the Constitution. It was added by George Washington, because Washington, remember, kind of got pressured into being president, and so it's less that Washington basically was smart enough to know what he didn't know. And so he created the cabinet as advisors in areas that he thought he really needed help in, or he wanted help in, not so much needed help in, but he really wanted help in. Ever since then, presidents have had the ability to fill in the cabinet, or to enlarge it, or to subtract it. Usually we only add departments in case of like a big disaster or something unusual we haven't seen before. For example, the Department of Homeland Security is the most recent one. It was added after the attacks on September 11th, 2001. So, the next one, the military. The president does have the use of the military. Remember, he is the commander-in-chief. However, the president's ability to use the military is somewhat limited. Nowadays, he can use the military for very short periods of time. Anything longer than 30 days requires an act of war by Congress. Still, 30 days is enough to get a lot of things done, and so the president has oftentimes used the military to go into places without a declaration of war, either for humanitarian purposes or for minor peacekeeping issues, things like that. The third one, treaty and executive agreement. Treaty and executive agreement refers to the ability of the president to make deals with other countries. Again, treaty and executive agreement is the ability of the president to make deals with other countries. Again, treaty and executive agreement is the ability of the president to make deals with foreign countries. What's the difference between the two? Well, a treaty is a formal agreement between the president and a foreign country. It has to be approved by the Senate, and it basically locks you in to an agreement. Breaking a treaty is, grounds for war in most cases. So treaties are long-standing, permanent relationships that have to be approved by the Senate. Executive agreements, on the other hand, are more informal agreements. They're oftentimes temporary and between the president personally and another leader personally. Basically, the idea is that, like, an executive agreement would be like if President Obama had an understanding with the president of France that, hey, we'll totally help you out if you need it. But the catch is that other presidents don't have to follow it because it's personally between President Obama and the President of France. A treaty, on the other hand, might be signed by President Obama and the other presidents are bound by it, unless something really interesting happens. Again, breaking an executive agreement just results in hurt feelings. The other countries might get cranky. Breaking a treaty is about the last thing you do right before you start bombing somebody, so keep that in mind. The last one, recognition. Recognition is the ability of the president to acknowledge that a new country exists. Excuse me. Again, recognition is the ability of the president to acknowledge that a new country exists. Third time, recognition is the ability of the president to acknowledge that a new country exists. Okay. What that means basically is that if the president, or when the president, sorry, it's late. Before the president can start relations with another country, God, that sounds weird, doesn't it? Before the president can open up diplomatic relations with another country, thank you, the president first must recognize that that country exists. We must acknowledge that the country exists, has a government, and so forth. Recognition is the first step to opening diplomatic relations. So, for example, let's say Saskatchewan breaks off of Canada. We wouldn't necessarily be able to trade with Saskatchewan without recognizing that it is its own country. While this seems like a simple formality, it's not always a given. For example, when the communists took over China, we did not recognize communist China for a good 20, 30 years. It wasn't until Nixon that we actually said, hey, look, that's actually China. We just referred to the communist Chinese as a disputed area and recognized only Taiwan as the actual China. Another example would be like the Syrian refugee crisis and things like that, whether or not we recognize the Syrian government or whether or not we recognize the refugees as their own country. All of that basically changes. Once recognition is given, though, it cannot be taken back unless there's a new government or a revolution or something along those lines. So if, for example, President Obama recognizes the government of southern France, other presidents can't unrecognize it unless there's something big that happens, like a new country or a revolution or a president dies or something like that. So recognition, again, is kind of a permanent thing when it happens. Hence why they tend to take it very seriously. The next one, legislative power. Again, the president doesn't actually make laws. That doesn't mean he can't still influence which laws are passed and which laws are made. Take, for example, the State of the Union. The State of the Union is a massive speech the president gives every year that discusses the state of the country, or the condition of the country if you want to avoid using the same term. State of the Union, again, is a massive speech the president gives every year that discusses the condition of the country. One more time, the State of the Union is a massive speech that the president gives once a year, discusses the condition of the country, or the State of the Union. Thank you. It's a big speech. It comes on all the networks. I'm sure you've probably seen it. It happens once a year. I want to say early February. The reason why the State of the Union, though, is significant is it allows the president to set the agenda for Congress. Remember we talked about how what the president talks about is more valuable than what congressmen talk about. So if the president spends his State of the Union talking about how I want a comprehensive education plan, that's going to force Congress to consider doing something. Because if he spends 45 minutes of primetime television or primetime live, whatever you want to call it, talking about this, it's going to kind of force Congress to go, maybe we should at least consider it. So the State of the Union, again, is oftentimes used by the president to force Congress to talk about an issue or at least to bring it to the forefront. The next one, a veto. We've talked about this. I believe it was in 2 chapters ago. The veto remembers the ability of the president to cancel any proposed laws. So Congress wants to make a law that bans vapor cigarettes. The president can veto it because he totally vapes. Veto cancels the law. It can itself be defeated, but defeating a veto takes 2/3 of Congress, whereas passing a law just takes half. So defeating a veto is very rare. The thing about a veto, though, is that a veto is all or nothing. If you veto, for example, you don't like a rider, the only way to get rid of the rider is to kill the entire bill, which is why sometimes they will attach things they know the president doesn't like to things that he can't easily veto. So they're trying to sneak it on through. There was the ability to get rid of certain parts. This is called a line item veto. The line item veto is the ability to get rid of certain parts of a bill without vetoing the entire thing. Only one president was able to do this, and that was President Bill Clinton. Clinton was able to do it for a period of time before the Supreme Court said that the line item veto was unconstitutional and is no longer able to be used. Now, in some states they still have it, but the president no longer has the line item. Okay, I think we just blinked out there. But in any case, the president no longer has the ability of the line item veto. Again, some states still have it, but, again, that's just the states. The president doesn't. Last one here, the executive order. Executive orders are statements or clarifications by the president that carry the same weight as a law. Executive orders are statements or clarifications by the president that carry the same weight as a law. Executive orders are statements or clarifications by the president that carry the same weight as a law. Basically what it is is that an executive order is supposed to be, again, a clarification of an existing law. It's not a new law. It's just supposed to be like it's an asterisk, if you will, to an existing law. For example, this is how the military got desegregated. President Truman did it by executive order. He said, Congress passes the declaration of war, and he adds an executive order that says all the armies at war have to be desegregated by race. So again, it's like adding a little bit of a detail to it. It's like adding an arrow, like penciling it in, like this goes into here, this slot or something like that. Executive orders are kind of tricky because the Supreme Court hasn't really gotten into how much the president can or can't do. Both Bush and Obama were very big on executive orders, and there's still very much a question as to whether that's okay or not. The general rule seems to be that Congress can get rid of an executive order with a new law, and other presidents can get rid of an executive order by issuing a new executive order. So they're not quite as permanent as laws, but they carry the same weight. Finally, you've got judicial. The president does have some judicial powers, mostly in the neighborhood of influencing the Supreme Court, which is where the Solicitor General comes in. The Solicitor General is the government's lawyer. The Solicitor General, again, is the government's lawyer. Once again, the Solicitor General is the government's lawyer, meaning that when the government is sued or when the government has to go before the Supreme Court to make an argument, the Solicitor General is the guy who does it. So he's the one who goes before the Supreme Court and says, here's why we think you should let this law stand, or when you sue the government, here's who is responsible for it. It's not the president's personal attorney, but the president does pick who he wants to be Solicitor General. So, based on that pick, the president can influence how well things are decided and which cases are going to survive and so forth. Beyond that, though, the president's other big judicial power is the power of clemency. Clemency is basically legal leniency. Clemency, again, is basically legal leniency. Third time. Clemency is basically legal leniency. And I'm sure several of you are asking, what is leniency? Leniency basically just means mercy, permissiveness, forgiveness. All of those would be fine. Basically, what the president can do, the president cannot make sentences harder, like he can't put someone in prison for longer, but the president does have a lot of abilities that essentially can lower someone's sentence or even forgive them for a crime. Take, for example, a reprieve. A reprieve is essentially a delaying of the sentence. Usually it's in conjunction with the death penalty. So if you're scheduled to die in December, the president can grant you a reprieve, which basically means we're going to push that off until something happens, like we look more into your case, until this new evidence is heard, until the Supreme Court hears your case, whatever. So a reprieve is like a delay in a sentence. We're basically saying we're not going to carry out the sentence yet. So that's reprieve. Pardon is legal forgiveness. A pardon is legal forgiveness. A pardon is legal forgiveness. The president basically says the crime never happened. You were let out of jail, or if you were never charged, you don't have to worry about it anymore. The president's pardon power is pretty absolute. Like, he doesn't have to give a reason, which is, there have been instances where a president has been accused of granting a pardon for financial reasons. Somebody gave him a lot of money and he pardoned them. But for the most part, the presidency is fine with pardons. They can just choose whoever they want. President Obama literally today pardoned a whole bunch of drug offenders for basically who are nonviolent drug offenders. So there's no real criteria for it, at least not any specific ones that you need to worry about. So pardon, again, is just his way of saying this crime never happened as far as we're concerned. The third one, commutation. Commutation is to shorten a sentence. To commute a sentence is to shorten a sentence. Commutation, again, is shortening a sentence, or to shorten a sentence. Third time. Commutation is basically shortening a sentence, or to shorten a sentence. So if somebody is sent to someone's sent to death row, you can commute that sentence to prison for life. Someone is sent to prison for life, you can commute that sentence to 20 years. Someone is put to jail for 6 years, you can say 30 days. The president is not forgiving them, like in a pardon, where the crime basically never happened under a pardon. Commutation is just shortening your sentence. So that might be, for example, again, like, you were sentenced to death and the crime certainly doesn't deserve that. Or you were sentenced to 10 years in jail for assault, but, you really shouldn't have gotten that badly, so we're going to give you 6 months. We're not saying you didn't assault the person, because you did, but we're also saying it doesn't warrant you being in jail for 10 years. The last one is amnesty. Amnesty is basically a group pardon. Again, amnesty is basically a group pardon. Third time. Amnesty is basically a group pardon. You're granting a pardon to a group of people. For example, after the Vietnam War, amnesty was given to all the people who dodged the draft. If we legalized marijuana tomorrow, amnesty would be given to all marijuana dealers. So you're basically giving a pardon to everybody. Usually amnesty only occurs in the case of like a law being changed. So you're saying that you no longer have to worry about this. Even though you did break the law, we are no longer going to be going after you for it. That's judicial power. Now, the president also has something else that he has in his back pocket, if you will, and that would be the first spouse. Generally speaking, first lady, but who knows, in 2 weeks that might change. The first spouse, what you're talking about again is the president's better half, their spouse. Again, in most cases, their wife, but again, we're being progressive here. It could be first husband or whatever. While the first spouse is obviously an unelected position, we don't choose who the president marries, that doesn't mean that they're not important. They do still have an impact. On this list here, I've given you 6 of them in particular, which are, fairly important. Take, for example, Dolly Madison. Madison, which for the record, I'm not 100% sure I've spelled that correctly on your outline. Somebody might want to look that up. Pause the video or whatever, just do a quick check. Because I want to say it might be Dolley, but that might also be the cupcake, so somebody will figure that out. In any case, Dolly Madison, wife, as you might guess, of James Madison. Dolly Madison is oftentimes considered to be the first lady, because, among other things, she served as first lady for Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson's wife passed away while he was president, and so as a result, Dolly Madison sort of stepped up to fill in the role. She is the one who basically codifies or solidifies what we think of as the role of the first spouse, which is to say chief hostess. Her job was to organize the parties, to organize the diplomacy, things like that. She is, again, sort of the head of the household, if you will. In addition, Dolly Madison also gets a lot of credit because she, during the War of 1812, actually ran into the burning White House to save the portrait of George Washington, which is the very famous one that is pretty much the only one that we have. She ran into the White House, which again was on fire at the time, to go and save the portrait of George Washington, which, for the record, if you know which portrait I'm talking about, is why the bottom third of it looks like it's missing, because it was on fire. So, Dolly Madison, important. The next one, Lucy Hayes. Lucy Hayes, wife of Rutherford B. Hayes. Lucy Hayes got the nickname of Lemonade Lucy because she was a big supporter of the temperance movement, which was the movement to ban alcohol. Again, Lucy Hayes, wife of Rutherford B. Hayes, got the nickname Lemonade Lucy because she was a big proponent of the temperance movement, which was the movement to ban alcohol. So basically, the reason why Lucy Hayes becomes significant is that Lucy Hayes is the first lady to really take a stand on a social issue. She influenced her husband to the point that Rutherford B. Hayes banned alcohol in the White House. Basically because of her influence. She was telling him, we need to do something. We need to set a good example for the country. And so she influenced him, not forced him, but she influenced him enough that he agreed to ban alcohol in the White House. So hence why Lucy Hayes becomes significant. She's one of the first times a first lady steps out of just being the quiet, submissive housekeeper and into actually taking a stand on an important social or political issue. The third one, Edith Wilson. Edith Wilson is a fun one. Edith Wilson is sometimes referred to as our first female president. She is the wife of Woodrow Wilson, who was president after World War I. Now, this takes some explaining. What happened was, Woodrow Wilson, towards the end of his term, was campaigning really hard for the Treaty of Versailles to get signed, and he suffered a massive stroke. And he basically became bedridden. Edith Wilson became the go-to. So what happened was, if anyone had any questions for the president, they would go to Edith, and Edith would go into the bedroom and talk to the President Wilson, and then come back out and tell them what they wanted to know. And so as a result, Edith became, again, the gatekeeper to President Wilson, which in and of itself would have been kind of impressive. But what's even more impressive is Wilson was basically brain dead. President Wilson at this point was more or less incapacitated. He could not be, talked to. So when Edith Wilson went into there, she wasn't talking to anyone. She was just figuring it out herself. Hence why historians call her the first female president, because for about good 6-8 months, she was the one running the country. Nobody knew it at the time because the fear was that if anyone knew that our president was basically dead, especially after a war, all sorts of chaos could happen. So she kept up this charade that all she was doing was talking to President Wilson, when in reality she was the one running the country. So, that's kind of impressive. The fourth one, Jacqueline Kennedy. Jackie Kennedy, wife of John F. Kennedy, gets a lot of credit for, or a lot of, what's the phrase I'm looking for? Credit will work. A lot of credit for trying to humanize the presidency. Again, Jacqueline Kennedy, wife of John F. Kennedy, usually gets her credit for humanizing the presidency. Among other things, she was the one who she brought a camera crew into the White House for a television special to take people around it and introduce the public to the White House. Because her whole point was that her family was not royalty. They are the people. They are servants of the public. And so rather than the White House being like this fortress where the American royalty are sequestered, no one ever sees them, she wanted to open it up to the public. So Jacqueline Kennedy sets up this image of the presidency. It changes the image of the presidency from, again, somebody who's above us to being a servant, someone who's one of us. And so Jacqueline Kennedy gets a lot of credit for that. The idea being that this is why you can have like the First Lady going on Ellen and no one bats an eye, because Jacqueline Kennedy humanized the presidency. The fifth one, Betty Ford. Betty Ford, wife of Gerald Ford. Betty Ford is oftentimes considered significant because, again, she takes a stand on a social issue. In her case, it was addiction. Betty Ford became a cause or a big sensation when she admitted that she was an alcoholic and she was entering treatment for it. Now, nowadays, that doesn't seem like much in the way of excitement. But at the time, you have to remember that alcoholics and any addicts were treated like essentially the scum of the earth. If you were addicted to alcohol or drugs, it was because you were a monster and because God hated you. Betty Ford coming out really helped to humanize and destigmatize addiction. When she came out and she said, look, I'm human. I have a problem. I'm getting help. It did a lot to America to see that, because then other people felt comfortable trying to come forward and getting help as well. Today, there still exists the Betty Ford Clinic, which is an addiction treatment center. It's one of the more famous ones in the world. It's one of the ones that the celebrities all go to when they get zonked out on something. And of course, the last one, Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton, wife of Bill Clinton. Hillary Clinton was significant for a couple of reasons. One is that she took, a little bit like Lucy Hayes, she was very significant in policy decision-making. But in her case, she actually did formal policy. She was one of the first ones to work on the healthcare law. In addition, Hillary Clinton has the significance, she's the only first lady to hold an elected office. She was the senator from New York from 2000 to 2008. In addition, she was also Secretary of State under Obama, and now, of course, she's running for president. And so it's entirely possible she will be the first elected female president. Which, again, that's kind of a lot of firsts for one person. So, again, hopefully what all of this demonstrates is that just because they're unelected doesn't mean they're not significant. The first spouse can have a very important role in life. Finally, what we're getting into is unique presidents. We're not going to go through all of them, but these presidents I've given you here, these are ones that have sort of significant firsts, or they're the only one, or something like that. Take, for example, the Virginia dynasty. The Virginia dynasty refers to basically the first 5 presidents of the United States, in the fact that 4 out of the 5 all came from Virginia. 4 of the first 5 presidents all came from Virginia. For the record, don't write it down, but John Adams is the weird one. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe are all Virginians. The Virginia dynasty is significant because, hey, they're all from Virginia, and that's kind of weird. But the other reason why the Virginia dynasty is significant is because they're the guys who basically set the tone. They're the ones who established the presidency as an important position of power. But also, they're the guys who do things like decide what the president's going to be called. You don't call him Your Majesty, you call him Mr. President. How, the president is a man of the people, not above the people, and so forth. So the Virginia dynasty are the guys who set the table. Now, Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, Andrew Jackson, who is going to be your 7th president, Andrew Jackson is a man of the people. Jackson is one of the first people who's elected from the public rather than the elites. The Virginia dynasty and the other presidents before him were largely a product of the upper class, the educated, the elite, the powerful, and so forth. Jackson, on the other hand, was a product of the average Joes. He was a drunken brawler, and everybody loved him. So Jackson is significant because he's the first person to really be elected by the people rather than by, again, the political elite. The next one, Abraham Lincoln, you've probably heard of him. Lincoln's big significance is he's one of the only presidents to be elected without a majority vote. Lincoln was elected in a year where we were heading into the Civil War, so the vote was split 4 ways. Lincoln got a majority of the Electoral College, but less than 50% of the popular vote. It's one of only, I think, 2 times in history where that's happened. And so that was a very significant thing. Lincoln also is the first Republican, and I should have mentioned that Jackson was the first Democrat, which is also kind of significant. Andrew Jackson was the first Democrat, Abe Lincoln is the first Republican. Next one, Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the only president to be elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. He was elected president in 1884, and then he lost in 1888 and came back in 1892. So he won 2 terms, just not in order. He's the only president where that happens. The next one, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt is the youngest person to become president. Teddy Roosevelt is the youngest person to become president, but not the youngest person elected president. The reason is because Teddy Roosevelt became president upon the death of William McKinley. And when he became president again, he was the youngest person to ever become president. However, when Teddy Roosevelt's own election came around, at that point, he was, I believe, 43, which makes him older than FDR and Bill Clinton, who would be the younger ones. Which brings us to JFK. Oh, no, actually, FDR is the next one, isn't it? So again, Teddy Roosevelt, youngest person to become president. JFK and Bill Clinton are the youngest to ever be elected president, but we'll get there. Next one, FDR. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, only president to have more than 2 terms. He was elected president in 1932, 36, 40, and 44. He was elected 4 times, died in the middle of his 4th term, but only president to have more than 2 terms. And thanks to the Constitution, 22nd Amendment, no other president will ever have more than 2 terms. So FDR kind of ruined it for everybody. So, thanks for that, Franklin. JFK, as I said, John F. Kennedy, youngest president ever elected. 42, I want to say. Again, somebody can look this up and prove me wrong, but again, early 40s, so youngest president ever elected. Also, one of our only handsome presidents. Seriously, look through my book of presidents. The vast majority are god-awful, butt-ugly. But that's just a different aside. Don't have to write that down. Please don't put that on the test. Next one, Geraldine Ferraro. This is probably a name you've never heard of before because she didn't win. Geraldine Ferraro is the first woman nominated for vice president. She was nominated in 1984 under Walter Mondale. Yes? Reasonably sure that's right? Yeah, it's whoever Reagan stopped in 84. Pretty sure it was Mondale. In any case, Geraldine Ferraro, first woman to run for vice president in a major ticket party. I don't know if you can hear that, but my youngest is crying. I'll be right back. Excuse me.